Welcome back to our next edition of the CBB Review Studio podcast. I am Dan Siegel, joined as always by my co-host Ben Anderson, and we have our two Final Four matchups ahead of us coming this Saturday. We have Florida Atlantic, the 9 seed, against San Diego State, the 5 seed. That one taking place at 6:09, and then we have the 5 seed Miami and the 4 seed UConn taking place right after that, scheduled at 8:49. Taking place in Houston. So we will go one by one. We'll preview each of those games. So let's start with FAU and San Diego State. Ben, I'll throw it to you first. What's the first storyline to look for in this matchup?
Look, my biggest question coming into this, and by the way, great to be on the pod again once back on a regular basis here. My biggest question here is, can San Diego State continue to play the style of game that it wants to and that it is good at? You've seen this happen all throughout the tournament so far. No one has scored more than 64 points against the Aztecs, and that was Alabama, arguably one of the most dynamic offenses we've seen in the country all year. Can Florida Atlantic break that trend? It's hard to say. Typically, you're going to need to score 70 or more to beat San Diego State, and that's just something I'll be watching for, just the score and also the type of game you see on the court.
Yeah, that's a great point. And one of the first things that I wanted to bring up is that San Diego State is built very similar to a team. I've mentioned this a lot of times before, but they're built very similar to Tennessee in that they have an elite defense, and their elite defense is built off of preventing teams from shooting well from the outside against them. San Diego State has opponents shooting 27.8% from three-point range this year. That's very similar to what Tennessee was heading into the tournament. They're not a great shot-making team either. I would argue San Diego State is a worse shot-making team. I mean, we've talked about that as well, and there have been some ugly shots we've seen, even in this tournament, even in wins that San Diego State has shot. And FAU, part of their journey was beating Tennessee. So I don't know. Florida Atlantic was able to make shots more so than Tennessee. Florida Atlantic, one of the best spacing teams in the nation. I think they're sixth in that shot quality metric. So those are my initial thoughts on this game.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. I had actually written in my notes. Look, Florida Atlantic basically already played San Diego State, except they were wearing orange and white in the Sweet 16 when they played Tennessee. They're very similar teams if you look at, especially on the defensive end. But I will say, though, that San Diego State has been on an insane run of defending the three-point arc in the tournament. Let's read off the percentages of their opponents. First off, 5 for 24, 6 for 26, 3 for 27. That was the Alabama game. And then 2 for 17 to go to the Final Four from Creighton. And those last two games, those are good three-point shooting teams. It's not like they're holding bad offenses to bad shooting nights. So I do actually think that arguably the Aztecs pose a greater threat than the Volunteers to Florida Atlantic in terms of stopping the three-point arc.
Well, let's talk about both teams. We've talked about it defensively, but let's talk about both teams on the offensive end, and let's start with San Diego State. What do you think they need to do offensively? I'll answer my own question first, actually, because I think it's all about just winning the individual matchups. It's going to be about one-on-one, San Diego State offensive player, FAU defensive player, and that's how they're going to win if they do, because San Diego State has players with athlete advantages, with strength advantages. They haven't shot the three well all tournament, so I highly doubt it changes in this game. And it's just going to be about individual players making plays. Matt Bradley has been their most reliable scorer. You see him on the side of your screen if you're watching on YouTube. He's, I believe, their only double-digit scorer on the season. And Darion Trammell has also really elevated his play. I think he's going to be a really valuable asset for San Diego State. Trammell is a below 6 foot point guard, so not the prototypical San Diego State player in terms of stature, but I think it's about just they're going to have to win individual matchups, shoot off the dribble, and make plays.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the big key here for San Diego State offensively is to get Matt Bradley going. You've mentioned that he leads the team in scoring, but he hasn't had a very good tournament so far. Sort of been invisible, especially in the last 3 games that they played. So the round of 32, Sweet 16, Elite 8. You really saw Trammell grow into a bigger role, as well as Lamont Butler offensively. So to beat Florida Atlantic, to beat anyone in the Final Four, frankly, but especially Florida Atlantic, I would like to see Bradley be the player that he was in the beginning of the season, and also for the past like 3 seasons. He's been a staple guard out on the West Coast, both at Cal and at San Diego State. So I think he's really a key to making sure the Aztecs are successful offensively. And then on the flip side, I do think Johnell Davis is the best offensive player in the game.
Yeah,
like just all things else equal, he can create his shot better than anyone else on the court. So I think he'll have to have a good game like he did, particularly against who was it Fairleigh Dickinson that he had the 25 and 10 game.
I believe so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
I don't think he needs to have that type of game necessarily, but I do think he needs to show that he is the most advanced offensive player on the court.
Yeah, and one thing I don't like about San Diego State's going back to their offense is they're the 9th most frequent mid-range shooting team in the country. So it's really going to be about how FAU defensively could force them into outside shots. Offensively, we saw a guy I've been talking about a lot, Vlad Golden, the big 7'1" guy. He's a great rim protector, but he also could be a very valuable piece on the offensive end as a finisher and just like around the rim, making plays, maybe posting up a little bit, because San Diego State doesn't have necessarily one individual guy that can match up against him. If he needs to be double teamed in the post or he needs to draw any sort of extra attention around the rim, all that's going to do is help the FAU shooters, and that's going to really assist them in having a successful shooting night against, like I said, a team that defensively gives up just 27.8% of their shots, barely over 1 in 4 shots from the 3-point range to go in.
I actually slightly disagree with you on that point. I do think that with Nathan Mensah in particular, I think he is good enough of a defender to take away Golden one-on-one, which would be a huge help for San Diego State, and that's how they are able to stay on the 3-point line so consistently and force contested looks from outside the arc. One last thing I will say on this game is that Florida Atlantic's defense is kind of underrated. I don't think people are talking enough just because they're a very balanced team. Nothing really sticks out, but they are 15th in the country in effective field goal percentage defensively. So for a team that already struggles in making shots, especially from outside of the rim, the painted area in San Diego State, that might be just something to monitor. I think we're headed for a low scoring affair nonetheless. And I would that over under is kind of high if I'm being honest, because that's what, like 65, 64 type deal. I'm not sure this game gets there.
Yeah. It seems almost suspiciously high, but regarding the spread, San Diego State -2, I definitely like Florida Atlantic. I don't think the Aztecs have been successful enough offensively, and I could easily eat my words because, look, the Hats have gotten here somehow, and San Diego State has probably had a more impressive path. I'd say they probably definitely have had the more difficult path. So they've been able to beat superior offensive teams so far by just slowing them down. Then again, Florida Atlantic's an interesting case. They've lost, like you see on the screen, 3 games the entire year. So San Diego State is not built any differently than a lot of teams they've beaten this year.
Yeah, I would agree with you in that prediction. I actually have Florida Atlantic outright. If you look at the numbers during the tournament, Florida Atlantic, actually hasn't shot the ball all that well compared to their season averages. It's not like they're blowing people away from beyond the arc. So if that's something you're going to hang your hat on with the Aztecs, is stopping them from the 3-point range, that's not really how Florida Atlantic has beat teams necessarily. So I want to see the matchup inside as well.
All right, you ready to move on to our second game of the night?
Let's roll.
All right, UConn and Miami. This one will be right afterwards. Probably the start time right now is scheduled for 8:49 p.m. on, like I said, CBS. The thing that stands out to me is the contrasting styles between these two teams. So even though, considering it's a Final Four game, I'd say UConn being 5.5 point favorites, that's pretty heavy for a Final Four game. But before we even get into that, just the battle of contrasting styles, I think Miami's just a great offensive team that will win one-on-one matchups. They're not great defensively, but they're ball pressure that they've been able to apply in the last couple tournaments actually has definitely been able to suffice. And then UConn, they've just been dominant on both sides. Actually, as we stand today, they are Torvik's number one team in the entire country. Not number one team remaining, just number one team overall. And they're more known for their size. They rebound really well. They're a great passing team. Not necessarily a team that's going to win isolated matchups. Not that they won't, but not as well as Miami will at least. And they'll protect the rim. They'll protect the post at a very high level. These two teams have had success in different ways, and that's what excites me about this specific matchup.
I think you and I are going to have differing opinions on this game because the more and more I look at the matchups here, the more and more I'm worried about Miami's chances to beat UConn. And I say this because of what we've seen so far from the Hurricanes in the tournament. Look, if you look back at the Elite Eight game, right, Norchad Omier was in foul trouble against Texas. And Texas is not a big team. They're just not. They don't really have big men. That's not their strength. They're a very guard-heavy program. How is the front court of the Hurricanes going to hold up against the pair of Adama Sanogo and Donovan Clingan? And I think that's my biggest question. Do you have any ideas, any thoughts about how Miami might go about this defensively?
No, I wrote down that that's going to be their biggest difficulty in this game because the problem with Omier, he's 6'7", maybe a generous 6'8". So if you're guarding Sanogo, you're definitely sacrificing a lot of strength and size. And if you're guarding Clingan, you're sacrificing several inches of height. So they're definitely going to have trouble guarding that big man duo. They're going to have to win despite that. It's not going to be something that they're going to really be able to keep in check, in my opinion.
No, I agree with that. And then even in the guard range, one thing UConn has over Miami in terms of the Miami's offense versus UConn's defense is the size. Like Nigel Pack and Isaiah Wong are very talented. They're very shifty, creative. They're the reason Miami's in the Final Four. But they're also 6 foot maybe and like 6'2" ish, right? All of UConn's guards basically, except for I believe Calcaterra, are at least 6'5". And just the length might bother them a little bit. And I would just be concerned about what that looks like and how it hampers the Hurricanes offense moving forward if you're going to get all of your production from your guards.
It's going to be Miami's going to have to force turnovers. That's the bottom line. They're going to have to force turnovers. They're going to have to get out and run. Look for them to potentially press, if not definitely front the post, because if you could force turnovers before Sanogo and or Clingan get the ball, then they're not going to get a shot up, because if they get a shot up and if they get deep post positioning with the ball, they're most likely going to score. So it's going to have to be about forcing turnovers before they even get the opportunity to really work their half court offense. I think that's going to have to be Jim Laranaga's plan, and not a plan that he's not been used to doing. He's definitely been able to defeat teams with that game plan. Look at their win against Houston. Yes, I know they don't offer as much skill offensively as UConn does, but they're definitely a vastly superior team if you look at it on paper. Miami defense versus Houston offense, and Miami was able to get by, and not only get by, but really hold Houston to low production numbers offensively.
Yeah, and the other thing I would say on Miami's game plan is not so much something they can control, but I think you just got to hope that UConn misses some shots. If you look at their history, especially that 6-game or the 8-game stretch where they went 2-6 in the middle of January, you tend to beat UConn not by outscoring them, obviously you outscore them, but you make it a lower scoring game, right? You're not beating them when UConn's scoring in the 80s. The most they scored in a loss was 79 points, and that was against Xavier, who had an elite offense. But I still don't think that Miami should have that plan, because Xavier did have that inside presence to mess with Clingan and Sanogo and Nunji, and I believe Fremantle was still playing at that point in that victory. So I think you just have to hope that shots aren't falling for Caravan and Hawkins, and Calcaterra. And that might be a lot to ask, but I think that's the best way to predict a Miami win.
And here's the thing, if you're looking at this matchup and how Miami could potentially win, it's just so difficult because even if you look at the players and the holistic season profiles, just these last 4 games and the tournament in general, UConn's just been unstoppable. We thought Iona might pose a threat to them despite UConn being a superior team. They go out and beat Iona by 24. Then St. Mary's, most of us thought UConn would handle them. 15-point win, though. Arkansas, 8 seed, could be that middle digit seed that makes that run similar to UNC last year. They have that makeup. You talked about that. Go out and beat them by 23. Then Gonzaga, who's Gonzaga, and you go out and beat them by 28. So it's just, who's to say that Miami could be the one to not only keep the game within single digits, but then go out and beat UConn if nobody else has. They started the year 14-0, and it was very similar. 13 of those, I think the first 13 wins were by double digits. It included a dominant win over Alabama, and I've said this before, they are right back to playing like they were in those first 14 games of the season.
Absolutely. If you're looking at this from the betting perspective, I think the right play is UConn -5.5. We've seen nothing from the Huskies to make us think that there would be an off night here. It reminds us of, occasionally we get these teams that just turn into absolute buzzsaws in the tournament. The Villanova teams are a great example. You could argue the Kentucky team in 2012 is a great example of that as well. North Carolina back in 2009 or whenever it was. But I will say, if you want to hedge your bet, I would go Miami money line because we haven't seen UConn in a close game in a long time, and we don't know what that looks like for players that might be a little bit stressed out. So if you wanted to make a wild bet here, Miami money line might be an option for you.
So you're saying there's a very low chance that UConn wins by 5 or less?
Yes, I would put that at 95%. That it doesn't happen. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I think the final factor I haven't talked about is even the difference between 13-0 UConn at the beginning of the year and UConn winning their first 4 games of the tournament is Newton running the point. And the way he's been playing, it's hard to even declare a weakness of this UConn team. And that's why I'm also going to have them not only winning, but covering the spread. Look, Vegas usually has a feel on things, so I'm not out here saying UConn's likely to win this game by 12 plus points, but I think with the numbers we're getting, I'm picking UConn. Both.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the play of a particular player because I did want to ask you a question about that. Yeah. Who do you think is the most important player out of all these 4 teams? Who do you think is the most important player for their given squad? Because I have 3 names that I'm looking at right now, and none of them are actually Huskies. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts.
That's an interesting question. Well, are we talking about just specifically their matchup against their respective team in the Final Four?
I'm talking about both their matchup against the expected team and also if they advance, what that looks like.
All right. So my first thought pops in my head right away was Sonogo, but that goes against my kind of theory that guards are most important, most superior in March. But then I look at the other teams like Miami. You take away Wong, he's their best player, but then you have several other guys that could play the role of Wong in any given night. And then Florida Atlantic, I don't know if they have like that one specific alpha. I think San Diego State, my first instinct would be Bradley, but he hasn't been playing at the level that he's necessarily accustomed to. So I'm curious your thought. My first instinct would be Sonogo still.
You mentioned none of the 3 players, which I find hilarious. I focus more on a depth perspective. Look, my first thought, if you take away Norchad Omier, who are you putting in?
Yeah.
AJ
That's
Casey. He's the only other guy above 6'7", like in their normal rotation.
Miller's around 6'7", right? But
Right, but that's a different type of 6'7" than Norchad is.
yeah, you're right.
Like that to me is the most important player on Miami and the most important player in the tournament. My other two picks were Golden for similar Vlad Golden for similar reasons. FAU in particular isn't very deep beyond beyond Golden. They have another 6'8" dude that comes off the bench. His name escapes me, but really that's their only other player that's in the regular rotation that's over 6'4". So that's something to keep in mind, especially if they move on and go and play UConn, if that's a problem. And then finally, I picked Darion Trammell. We mentioned him before, but he is the only player, in my opinion, on San Diego State that can consistently create his own shot.
Yeah.
And I think that's really vital.
Has an outlier offensive number in the positive direction. It's going to be because of Trammell.
Correct. Yeah. That's so vital in March, especially in the Final Four, for you to have people that can create your own shot. That I think taking him away from San Diego State would be detrimental, really, to a large extent.
All right. Well, that will do it for today's edition of the CBB Review Studio podcast. Be sure to give us a like if you are watching on YouTube. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast if you are watching on YouTube or listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And we will be back with the Final Four games done and the championship matchup set. We will recap the Final Four and preview the championship. And it's bittersweet at this point in the year because there's 3 games left, but it's the 3 most important games of the year. So
hey, don't disrespect the NIT final all CUSA matchup. That's coming
true.
in Saturday or something, and we got the women's Final Four. We don't only have 3 games. Don't worry, we still got basketball yet to come.
And plenty of coaching stuff to talk about,
Mm-hmm.
which will be a lot of fun. But yeah, that will do it once again. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening, and take care.